Elise and Dave, welcome back to the show. I am thrilled to have you here today. And there is a reason why the two of you are joining me on this interview, and we'll unfold the entire story behind it. So we'll just jump right into the topic and then take it from there. So let me ask you, is online work and working from home destroying creativity?
Maybe. I don't know. I think the reason it will become more clear the more we get into this. I think the party line right now is we have our individual personal hunches and experiences, but I don't think there's anything out there that definitively says yes or no. And there's probably instances where it is, and there's probably instances where it isn't. And we're on the hunt to try to make it so that it's not destroying it.
I think that's the key, right? Like, yeah, maybe, and maybe for you, or maybe for you, but not for me, or maybe me for me, but not for them. Or, you know, the context of that question should be rich, and it isn't always. So
how is it for you? What is your perception on, and how would you even measure creativity?
So in this process of finding out where it's destroying, where online work is and is not destroying it, I have learned something about creativity, which I didn't know about it before, which is the definition. I always just approached, oh, that's creative when I saw it. And it was more of what we call a gut feel. So I've learned to, the proper definition, the definition is that it's a process, a product that is both novel and useful, which is that last part. And at first, when I heard it, and this was from our interview with one of our advisors, Dr. Ronnie Ryder-Pahlman, I was useful. I didn't buy it at first. And then the more and more I thought about it, yeah, if it's not useful, then it's just thought provoking. It wouldn't necessarily be creative. So it has to solve something. But as far as measuring it, we are relying on people who do measure these things to help us with that. But that's always been me more just subjective style from a measurement standpoint. Oh, that's really creative. Or, yeah, okay, I guess I could have thought of that too. You know, maybe it's not as creative as it appears.
Sounds as if you at least used to measure creativity only on the first part of the definition. So it's novel. So is it creative or is it novel enough? Air quotes. And although I would love to go down the rabbit hole to discuss whether creativity has to be useful and whether this is a necessary condition. And before deciding to go there or not to go there, I think it's maybe a good time to take a step back and to ask, why do you actually care? And maybe give us a little bit of an insight of the project you're currently planning and where it all started, that you even asked the question whether online work and working from home is destroying creativity.
I think your previous question, you know, how do you measure creativity for yourself, leaps ahead and presupposes that measuring creativity is a thing that we do as designers and facilitators and whatnot. And I have to say, part of the inspiration for our current project was being confronted by a research study that looked at whether meeting in person or meeting online was more creative. And it posited that meeting in person was, in fact, more successful for more people. You know, they were able to come up with more creative measures, creative ideas, and they measured them. And I looked at that study, and there were a number of things about it that were confusing to me, but one of them was that they were able to measure the relative creativity of a bunch of ideas that were brainstormed by students. And I'm like, how do you say that this alternative use for a Frisbee is mathematically more creative than this other alternative use for a Frisbee? And they had a way to do it. So there were a number of things happening in this research study that was published in April that posited answers, right? It posited that when we are in person, we can be more creative. And when we are meeting over video conference, that inhibits our ability to be creative because our eyes are looking at the cameras and the screens rather than taking in all of the things that from our rich environment that might stimulate that creativity. And the media picked this up. Now, the study itself is narrow. It's looking at a very small thing. It's trying to come up with a very, isolated variable, simple answer. But the media picked it up and said, okay, that's it. The research is in. The evidence is clear. Zoom kills creativity and remote work is dead. Which is pretty ballsy, frankly, and not actually reflective of what was in the study.
And one question, just to clarify, did the study actually claim that the number of ideas that students came up with related to a very specific prompt can be stated as creativity? Or was it really just, okay, these students came up with more ideas, and hence our study shows that people can come up with more ideas on-site than online, and the media just interpreted it as creativity?
There was a nod to that. The last part was, yes, I think the initial study said there's more quantity of creative ideas generated online. It was, I suppose, statistically significant enough for the paper to come out and say there's an edge here. Of course, the media picked it up and went hyperbolic with the headlines. To the first part of that question, I don't know that they went through each of the ideas. So the methodology was.
Oh, they totally did. They totally rated them based on creativity because they had decision quality based on. Yeah. So anyway.
Right, but I think where I was going with that, I didn't get the sense that they threw any ideas out because it wasn't quote unquote. They didn't say, well, that's useful or that's not. I think they ranked them, but they weren't throwing anything out because if it was said, if somebody came up with the idea, I think it was just considered, oh, that's an idea. We're going to throw it in the
okay. So every idea is valid, but it's not.
Yes, it didn't necessarily solve It was so let's take the use of a Frisbee, for example, come up with a creative use. I think really what they said was come up with an alternative. I think that's what really it was. If you and I could sit here and agree that we could use a Frisbee as a coaster, that we counted that. But I don't know, I have right on my desk here, I have 9 other things on my desk that could also be used as a coaster. It's not necessarily solving a problem that I have. It's just an alternative use of a Frisbee. So I don't know if it necessarily fits that useful or that novel and useful definition. But we maybe don't want to go down the methodology rabbit hole on this.
Right. So there's all kinds of methodology going on in this one study. And, some of which we can agree with, some of which we might not agree with. But the key point was that the media took it as a done deal, black and white. This is how this works. And this is how you need to make your workplace decisions based on what the research says.
Right. And I think the other point to add in the methodology, there is nothing in the methodology that any of us here and probably anybody listening to this podcast would actually recreate if they were hired or if they had to go in and run a workshop or a meeting for some sort of creative output. There is nothing in that methodology that we know works from our experience And so that's what we said. If these decisions or these outcomes are going to result in workplace policy, we should at least know this based on sound methodology.
So what I hear is that what they claim is the measurement of creativity has nothing to do with our common practice as facilitators, who are actually in charge to foster, encourage, and create spaces that encourage creativity. So this has nothing to do with it.
Quite the opposite, because you're getting this peer reviewed, you want to control as much as possible. So you remove things, or we try to bring things into the environment to spark creativity. They're trying to remove things to control it, so the study gets passed for peer review.
Yeah, and we could also go down the rabbit hole of why this might be still valid in an academic context, because it's controlled so you can compare, and they're not talking about creativity in general. But then I would be curious to hear from you, what was it about the study that made you care so much that you now are actually running a global experiment yourself and a symposium? And why did someone, why, let's start with that one. Why do you care that much?
Because it's there, because it's a question. I think it's a very interesting question, very relevant to what it is that we all do. It's certainly, when I read this study, it hit me, and it certainly hit pressed a button, because I don't know that I agreed with it. And I thought this was a chance for us, the people who, the facilitators, the innovators, at a moment in time, the right moment in time, to really put this to the test. We had an opportunity to shape what work was going to look like. When I think organizations, quote unquote leadership, were maybe open to reconfiguring the optimal working environment. And so I think it was relevant, it was interesting, and there was a chance to make an impact. I think I've never actually really thought about, other than like, oh, I do feel like I want to answer this question. But I think those are probably the three things.
Well, and I think it's to be honest and back up on it, it's a flow of serendipitous opportunities, right? This whole project is kind of how I think in some ways creativity is meant to happen. Mm-hmm. So the problem was posited by this study that business world was listening to an answer, a definitive black and white research answer that we did not believe was representative of the kind of work that we can do or our own experiences. So you have a couple of options, right? You can say, hey, they're wrong, heck with them, and call people out on the internet.
Which is what I did. Which is what I did.
Okay. But it's a fabulous provocative marketing technique, right?
Yes. And so, yes, that's, well, and then Elise responded.
Right. So, rather than sticking with, hey, these folks are wrong, the question then becomes, well, how do we know? How do we know they're wrong? I mean, yeah, I've got my experience, you've got your experience, but so do the people doing the studies, right? And I think what we have discovered is possible is not necessarily probable in every business environment. So there is more research warranted. And we happen to have relationships with lots of meeting scientists. We happen to have relationships with lots of facilitators. We've got a bunch of creative people. We know how to look at things. Why not run better experiments? And by better, I mean experiments that are more reflective of the kind of work we would like to do with our clients, not necessarily more rigorous or academic, but definitely closer to what you might do in the field. And so with that in mind, let's kick up a big experiment.
Yeah. So what I hear is that instead of questioning the rigorosity of this academic research. You're rather taking a step forward, okay, looking at the practice of what we're doing. Is the claim that the media made out of it, Zoom is killing our creativity and we should stop working from home, to rather put this as a test?
Not only put that to the test, but also to say, look, one, when we use different methodologies, the kinds of methodologies that facilitators and design thinkers would be proud to see used, does that finding hold? You know, do we still see a difference in creative outputs of teams? And if it does, what does the evidence suggest we can do given the reality that many of us will be meeting online or in hybrid workplaces, regardless of what the research says, right? Yeah. So given your context, what are your best options in terms of research-backed, evidence-based practices for unleashing team creativity, which is a very different question than, hey, what is the impact of this camera on our ability to make a list?
And from your gut feel, do you think that there is a difference between online and offline in terms of encouraging, fostering creativity?
I think there's a big difference between the experiential outcome and the on paper outcome, the business outcome. Personally, I suspect that teams meeting online using tech to enable their workshops will come out with more stuff, right? They'll have more ideas, they'll be able to use chat, you'll have more quantifiable communication episodes or interactions, because there are more ways to communicate and collaborate when you've got tech that enables all the quiet voices. I think people who meet in person will talk about that being a more meaningful personal experience. And they will have trouble where they're distracted by the cookie bar and we may have to throw their data out, but otherwise it will be potentially something that has deeper resonance and deeper ability to change minds, hearts, and feelings. That's my gut.
I don't disagree. I've been thinking about it. What happens after, right? So we can come up with the creative solution in the workshop, wherever it takes place. But then we've then got to implement it, and depending on what it was we met to solve, that could be easy. If it's something just in my team, we're going to change the time of the weekly meeting to, oh, we're going to introduce a new product, or we're going to change our business model.
We're going to save the planet.
We're going to save the planet.
Right.
So, because I think this was one of the questions you sent us ahead of time, Miriam, and it got me thinking, and now I even forget what the question was, but I'm answering it, which is, so can you get more creative in one or the other? We don't always meet. We don't always have these workshops to come up with the most creative idea, right? That's not always because we then have to go implement that thing. And there's a lot of, there's research that shows actually you shouldn't come together. Like maybe you should be apart and creativity happens individually. But one of the reasons we come together is because we all get clarity and we can all agree upon something. And it's much easier to implement something later on if you were all together and you feel like your voice was heard in putting the solution together. And all you're really looking for is an adequate enough solution. It doesn't have to be the most, but an adequate one enough that also can then get implemented. So from that sense, I don't know, we create capture documents after a workshop. An in-person workshop, we take pictures of everything. Maybe we recorded some video. Is it easier to bring people in and get a sense of buy-in, after the workshop and kind of recreate that from our standard capture doc that we would take in an in-person workshop? Or is it easier from a Miro board to bring people in and show the process and gain steam for a change? I think I don't know. I think it might be. So I don't disagree with Elise in terms of, the quantity and quality of experience in those different channels, but I also adding another dimension to it. We're not there just to get a creative idea, because that's a point in time or a couple of points in time. But if I can't implement it, if I can't make the change, then what's the point even if it was really creative?
And I am just wondering, is creativity or creativity as a quantifiable measure, is it maybe overstated? Because as you said, at the end of the day, we only need one idea. And this one idea maybe is not supposed to be the most creative idea, but the idea that makes most sense in terms of costs and benefits. And then what is the process that is most beneficial for a group to come up with this one idea that we need and not the million?
Right. To that definition that Ronnie gave us, Elise, it's novel, it's useful, and then it's implementable, right?
Feasible.
Feasible. Better word.
So I think one of the things you're getting at is one of the challenges that we have with this whole program. And just to, just set a little bit of context, because I don't think we quite have yet. Study inspired us to get together. We said, okay, let's run a better experiment. And to do that, we've created an advisor board and laid out a whole plan, which begins soon with a kickoff symposium where we bring people in to explore all of these questions, right? What is creativity? How do you do things online? What's going on in the brain? Should you even do this? How do you set up your workplace? All these kinds of things. After which we'll figure out exactly what these processes are and run some experiments. And one of the tensions we have is that we have the starting spot. We've got this egg, which was a very narrow study on the effect of camera use on brainstorming and deciding which of those brainstormed ideas was best. And a curiosity to build evidence-based solutions around doing innovation work in a hybrid setting, in a hybrid world. Innovation work asks for different kinds of creativity at multiple stages throughout the solutioning process, right? So you're going to bring a new product to life. There is creativity in the whole idea of what might we even do in the first place? Creativity in how do we engage our users? Creativity and how do I implement this thing right at this moment? There are all kinds of different phases going on. And one of our speakers is going to be talking about the research they're seeing, what they're seeing about how being either offline or together impact things at each of those stages. And it's different, right? It's completely different depending on where you are in the process. So a real interesting tension where we have this start and then we have this bigger world we're trying to be relevant within.
And what it triggers in me, thank you for creating the context, Elise. I think that's very important also for the audience. And I wonder whether in this context that you're describing, whether we have to redefine what we understand by hybrid. Because hybrid at the moment is used as some people in the same space and do something together and others join from online to work together with the same group. But from what I hear you are saying is this hybrid of some things work better online, some things work better together in the same space. And it's how you use tech and the opportunity to collaborate these days. So that enhances the entire process.
Right. So you've got hybrid work policy, you've got hybrid work practice over time within teams, and then you've got a hybrid encounter, right? And each of those have different flavors and techniques to them for sure. And they all absolutely impact the innovation process. So when you see these recommendations, what are they talking about? When are they relevant? When are they not relevant? So.
And I think a lot of when companies are trying to figure out their hybrid work policy, I think they're really answering the question, where are people going to work? Like just that question, where do my people work? And they're not asking what Elise just stated. They're not asking what work gets done best in this setting versus that setting, which is maybe a better way to maybe a longer way, but maybe also the right way to answer the where do my people. Maybe the where is down the line after we answer a couple more important questions.
And do you think that it's then really about the creativity, or is it about productivity, or would it actually be the same thing? That
I think it's about innovation.
Yeah.
Which is the marriage of those things. Right.
I think productivity is an industrial era metric. And I think if we refer to it as being productive, I think that's when the bots are going to do it. Like if the best measure of whatever task is that it was productive, then a bot is going to take it over.
I had a really fascinating conversation about that last night, actually, that I think is relevant.
And I would say that bots, and then I'm curious to hear what Elise says, bots might take over the efficiency part. Bots are maybe more efficient, but productive, meaning that we get more product out, a more valuable product. It depends on the task.
See, I think that's where we're scoping on what productivity is. Productivity is purely output. If you want to be strict about it, and that's where I think Elise was going with it's a hybrid. But as soon as we start to say, oh, it's good, productivity was never intended to measure good.
So one of the on the hybrid policy thing, right? What we just talked about, having clarity about what kind of work works best when you're together and what kind of work works best when you're apart. You know, I understand why leaders shy from doing that level of diligence because A, it's hard and complex and messy, especially if you've got a very large workforce. And then the story and where this is relevant, I have a process we've designed that helps a leader do that in a reasonable way. Like it's a 1-month plan. Here's how you can walk people through and you can get those answers efficiently and make sensible decisions based on what actually works in practice. And what they are finding as they go to implement it, it basically works like this. You say, okay, look, everybody, we're going to run an experiment to figure out when teams really do need to work together. Our evidence seems to suggest you want to be in the same room if you're doing something like brainstorming, for example, or having your sensitive team conversations or, you know, those kinds of things, and that most of these kinds of work can be done remote. But to see if this is true for us, we want you all to come and spend a week in the office with your team. And during that week, every day, you're going to, at the end of the day, say what worked better because we were here, what was harder. And you're going to gather the data. And at the end of the week, you'll say, okay, this is what we want our plan to be. We don't need to come in at all, or whatever it is. So business leaders have been trying to do this. And one of the things they're finding is that some of their team members have moved to other cities. Some of their team members have decided that they have medical exemptions that mean they can no longer drive more than 10 minutes, right? This whole, we are not used to doing it. And one of the things they keep hearing is, I don't do people anymore.
Whoa.
I don't do people anymore. You can talk to my union rep because I don't do people. Now, if you are someone who does not do people, that's a good candidate for a bot. Because what is the work of the future if it doesn't require you to make a decision, make sense with, form agreement with another person?
Yeah.
Yeah, at least the knowledge work size. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Everything that doesn't require collaboration and cross-pollination can eventually be, and is repetitive, can and will eventually be replaced by bot. Mm-hmm.
Especially on the knowledge work side, I think. You know, the number of bots out there that can answer support calls and scan the forms and make automated decisions and, you know, write quick articles.
or emails.
And then there's
Or
the people
emails.
side. And then there's a people side. And when we look at, and I'm sure there were studies about that, with people who believe that they're speaking to another person versus they're believing that they're speaking to a bot. They would rank their experience more enjoyable and pleasant when they had the impression that they talked to a real person. Unless it was, I think, unpleasant, and then it's there would be more forgivable towards a bot than towards a person.
Right. We just don't expect as much from them.
Yeah.
So bringing all of that back to this experiment, right? The decisions about when and whether we need to bring people together are enormously complex right now. Partially due to things about, how our practice has evolved. In the facilitation world, we can do amazing things we couldn't do 3 years ago online. So a lot more is possible. And we have interesting resistance on both sides. People who don't want to do things online still and want to bring everybody back together, and people who never want to come back together and see their colleagues again. So this is quite an exploration.
And is it possible that the two coexist? So what if it was, and I think you mentioned that earlier, what if it wasn't really about online or offline or the tech or the methods, but it was purely about personalities? What if there are personalities who do work better in the same space with other people and others who work better online if there's the safety of a screen and social distance present?
Don't you think that's probably true? And has to be kind of irrelevant at the same time.
Yes, I believe this is true. And if I understand you correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds as if we agree that although we all have our personal preferences, it still makes sense to sometimes force us to get out of our comfort zone. So if I prefer online, it would be valuable for me to meet a group in person on site in the same space for a brainstorm, because for creativity, we do need these different personalities to come together. That's what we are doing with workshops and facilitation anyway, right? So how can we create sufficiently safe space or comfortable spaces for those who actually don't do people anymore to still feel comfortable doing people?
So this is interesting. I went back across, we conducted interviews with our 8 advisors, you being one of them. And one of the questions that we asked was, what's the most important job skill for the next 5 years? Now, if I had to step back and say one theme that I think it was Sam who actually, it was her skill was, now I'm getting confused, but the theme was, how can you maintain your humanity in a world where we are going to we're going to have more screens and more screens between us. And it was Joe who said specifically, the most important job skill the next 5 years is communication flexibility. Can you be a good communicator? And I'm interpreting what you said, Miriam, as being able to create those spaces, be able to create that humanity across any channel, whether it's a text, a Slack, in person, on a Zoom, wherever it is. Do you have the flexibility to be human across all of them?
Is it flexibility or authenticity?
I think that's probably right. Can you be yourself, and can you create that environment where others can be themselves?
Yeah.
And that's channel agnostic.
I don't know if it's authenticity. I think it might be effectiveness, but.
And I wonder whether our memory is just too short, because when I think back to the beginning of the pandemic, when most of the world was locked down, And I remember how many individuals shared that they found community, warmth, compassion, connection online where they've never expected it. So how come that now, 2.5 years later, where we are back in the situation where we could have both, we suddenly nullify this previous experience?
My guess is because we were all really open to it when we had this collective shock. And I think we all were figuring it out, and we were in a really vulnerable state. And I think now we're used to it, and it's become mundane.
So does it then boil down to vulnerability?
Or novelty.
Or novelty.
Mhm.
So
I think
it is
yeah.
attractive because it's novel. So it was interesting, and we're willing to open up because it was new.
It's kind of like travel. No.
Yeah, and we had a gap, right? We had a space that was open where things had been and then they were not. And all of the, Zoom came in zoomed in to fill the space. And since then, that space has been Zoomified like mad. People are kind of ready not to be on Zoom or Teams or whatever all day.
Zoom fatigue became a word.
It became a word, right? There's another one for Teams I heard recently, and I can't remember what it was. Teams TV. They were talking about how it was like binge watching their Teams meetings. Or like when my grandparents would have the news on all day, sitting in their chairs, it's kind of like that with Teams meetings. So, the novelty factor is not there. And I don't know about for you, but for me, I spend so much time in front of this screen that even though I have all these tabs open of things that I would love to investigate, fascinating papers and interviews and podcasts and all this stuff, when I get to the end of the workday, I am like, I don't care what's there. I will never read that because it is on a screen and I am so done.
And isn't it the same? Isn't it the same with the other extreme? If I'm in front of people all day, if I'm working at an information center and every 2 minutes I have a new person standing in front of me asking me questions, at the end of the day, I'm tired. I don't want to speak to my friends, asking me questions, right?
Right.
Isn't it all at the end about balance instead of claiming the extremes that one version or the other is killing humanity, creativity, authenticity?
Right.
Well, and then you get back to some of what we're trying to achieve with this experiment, right? It is very possible as we run this experiment that we will find an extreme answer, right? Like that could happen. We could find that online workshops, when well designed and facilitated, completely crush their in-person equivalents. I hope not, though. I hope what we find is a range of good possibilities. I hope we find that there are some people for whom this setting works really well and some people for whom this setting works really well, and that they have very radically different experiences, and that the data is messy. And not messy from a, don't freak out academic advisors, not messy from a, like, we can't analyze it, but
not noisy.
Not noisy, but I hope it gives us complex answers. I hope it makes us say, you know what, that points at and hints at things we need to test again.
And I wonder whether, well, listening to you and explaining that the answer will most probably be a complex one. So maybe in the data, it will look as if it's just the same, but then we'll find the extreme cases. And I wonder whether then looking into the data might point to actually the authenticity, charisma, or whatsoever of the facilitator. And that the outcome might be surprising, similar to what Google found when they were looking, what is it that makes a highly effective team? and they found, okay, it's psychological safety, something that they didn't look for initially.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't be surprised if it is actually the charisma or the presence or something about the person who is creating a space for groups to be creative that might be a driver.
Or maybe it's the fact that people feel they have control over the schedules and they are where they want to be. And maybe it adds to that, but it could just be, all right, I just feel in control, where I think a lot of people are rejecting these policies because nobody likes to be told what to do.
Yeah.
And it could be as simple as like a really well-worded question. Right? Like there are some things that are just so small that can make such a big difference. It'll be fascinating.
But then I assume that the question would be the same across all the experiments that you're running.
Well, that is an interesting question and an opportunity for anybody who sees and listens to this, because the number of questions we get to test is dependent on the number of teams running the test. So if we've got 50 teams running the experiment, we basically get to test one process. And we get 50 comparison points. But if we get 1,000 teams that want to run this experiment, maybe we can compare more than one way to do this within the same scope. So bring all of your teams, run 5 experiments, make it a party week. It'll be so great.
And by teams, you mean teams working together in a formal setting, or
nope,
a random group of people who would sign up as a team?
Yeah, any collection of individuals who can read and write that in English, of 12 to 36 people. What
would be the ideal outcome?
That's the question we asked all the advisors.
And that's not fair. I think from a study standpoint is that we can point to results that we feel confident in saying. I don't know what that is, but we've covered maybe a couple of what they might be over the course of this conversation. Be here when you want to make or when you want to be creative, or do this, or be here when you want to make a decision, and just have enough participation, tying off to the sign up, the call for sign up. The more people we have, the more observations, the more confidence we'll have in the results. And I think that's really what we're hoping for. I think we'll certainly have anecdotal evidence, and but I think we'd like to have a good balance of that, plus some of the academic rigor that started this whole process in the first place. But I think we're trying to find what's the right balance so we can bring in some of that variation, some of that what we know in our gut. But there's also some research that says works with the rigor of an academic study. So I think if we can come out with some conclusions that are backed by these observations, I think we'll be happy.
I'd take it farther. I think we could take it farther. So I think absolutely we should have some conclusions. I mean, so another thing we haven't talked about is what will teams be brainstorming about when they get together? And for that, because we're trying to look at what happens in a real innovation scenario, in real innovation, you brainstorm about things you care about, something that matters to you, right? You've got a product problem, you've got a family member you need to find a new housing for, right? Like there are real things that matter in your real life that need to be dealt with. Well, how do you do that in a global experiment with volunteers? Our thought was that, hey, we all live on the same planet. Maybe we can do some brainstorming about some of the issues that are facing us at a global level. And so we have invited people to come and present challenges related to global sustainability, economic equity, all of these kinds of topics. And we will be selecting one of those. The people at the symposium will crowdsource and select one of those for us to use in this experiment. So as an outcome, ideas from experiment teams that might actually make a difference in how we work collectively to live in a better planet in the future. So that's one thing I would love to see happen, like actual honest to goodness change. Second, ideas, evidence that changes how teams meet when they are together, lets people say, hey, we do need to come together, or we don't need to come together, with confidence so that they can help equalize some of the preferences on their teams. Third, fabulous hope and energy pumped into large-scale studies like this, so that the research community and the practitioner community can partner more often on more complex, more nuanced work that has a better chance of being immediately relevant to the kinds of things we need to do to make better workplace policies going forward. And then I want to change how people think about these kinds of questions. I want to be part of the growing movement that makes people go, you know, when I see something out there that says black or white, I start thinking, how might we test that? What else might be going on? How can I investigate some more?
Critical thinking.
Yeah. And so it's not, we have to be together or we have to be online versus offline. There's none of this versus stuff when it's talking about how to come together as people. Yeah.
Which brings us back to the facilitator's mindset, right? Where we replace the buts or the either or and bring them together with an and. And what I hear is in your vision to find a way to counteract this fake news era. Right?
Yeah.
We see a study and then instead of just quoting it or taking it for granted, looking at different ways to interpret it or to question it, challenge it.
Use it even, but go ahead and get complex, get long-term, get comfortable with being curious. I think that would be a great outcome.
So what I hear is that the issue with the initial study and where one thing that might already make or break creativity is whether actually the people care. So can we be creative about something that is irrelevant to us?
Like, how do you do useful? Like, so one of the original prompts was, creative alternative uses for a Frisbee. And it's like, well, uses?
Why should one care? Yeah. So according to you, what are you doing to engage teams in creative idea generation? So as facilitators, so you're inviting other facilitators to come up with designs to test. And I would be curious how you as practitioners, facilitators do it.
I generally approach this kind of work to try to set as much context before answering the thing. What are the usefulness of a Frisbee outside of throwing it back and forth? Like, if that's the important question, setting context, using metaphor, using visual thinking to frame the problem, to come at it differently, and then go and try to answer the question after you've warmed up. I think a lot of times people want to jump in a room and just say, all right, so what are the creative uses of a Frisbee? And that's where I think initially the rejection of the methodology came in, is because there was nothing in the room, there's nothing in the methodology to spark anything.
Which comes then back to the question, the prompt, what Elise said.
Yeah. So I think the more lateral, the more slanty, it may seem or disconnected or irrelevant at first. And I can't tell you how many workshops I've been in the first quarter, the first half of the workshop, people are wondering, when are we going to get to the question? But then in the back half, you realize all of that was done because when you then pose the question, you generally create a more useful, creative, and thoughtful solutions.
Would you compare it then with a sports competition where you cannot ask people to compete and to run as fast as they can if you don't give them the opportunity to warm up their muscles before?
Yeah, I use that a lot. I say sometimes, like, going in and asking the Frisbee question, the first thing, it's kind of like, it's like putting Usain Bolt in a box for like 2 hours and then opening the box and telling him to go run 100-meter dash. Yeah. So yes.
Yeah.
You got to warm up.
I use a dancing metaphor. I think you need to do more than warm up. I mean, you have to warm up, but you also have to learn how to work together. So there's the warming up of your own facility to be present and in the space, right? One of the facilitators I admire says, give the moment for the soul to arrive, which I think is a lovely, lovely saying. But there's also how we are a we together that is shaped collectively. And in dancing, if do either of you dance?
Yeah.
Sure.
Sure. Yeah. So have you ever done like salsa or ballroom or tango or West Coast swing or any of these things? You hold your partner and you create a frame. And if your arms are floppy and they go to move, like when they move at you, you just kind of and then you can't work together, right? So you need to create just enough tension between the two partners so that when one moves, the other knows to move too. And you can communicate, right? And that, getting rid of the noodle arms that happens when a group doesn't know how to lead and follow and interact in a way that keeps them in the dance is an incredibly important part of getting to that place where you can then be creative, in my opinion. So for me, when I do team creativity, we do a lot of noodle arming stuff and then we go away. We don't do it in a single session necessarily with all people talking to each other all the time.
Which is interesting because especially with the frame and dancing, it's then the muscle memory that works. So it might not work in the same session, but then 2 days later, 3 weeks later, suddenly it works. And this makes me then wonder whether, if you're inviting teams versus groups to sign up for the study, to take part, it would then be interesting to see whether those who signed up as a group of friends who come and brainstorm together, whether they are more creative, in air quotes, by generating ideas, as compared to a group of strangers or a group of teammates. And related to that, I then also wonder whether the outcome of the study of online versus offline is actually not driven by the online or offline, but by this time together as a warm-up, even if it's not used as a warm-up. So is it possible that by simply being together in a waiting room, in a physical waiting room, where we see each other's presence and where we have small talk just because we can, already has an impact on the creativity that follows after? And this is something we cannot replicate online, this kind of waiting room where you just turn to your neighbor and have a little chit chat before we start.
Fascinating, right? Like you're right. Like that might be a huge difference. I also think it's going to be fascinating because we've reached out to communities like yours, like Miro, like Mural, Butter, all of these groups of facilitators who swim like this together all the time.
Yeah.
So social lubricant, technical acumen, put those things together. Existing teams within a workplace that have to like look at each other afterwards versus teams that don't, country, region, age, profession. Now, if we can find commonalities that span all of those differences, that's fascinating.
Yeah. And would you then, I remember that before you said that in the initial scientific study, nobody judged the level or the quality of the ideas. Is this something that you would do in your study? So if you're asking teams to generate ideas for a higher public good, like saving the planet, how do you judge whether an idea is good or bad, or is an idea just an idea?
So I think in the original study, they did actually have them rank them based on creativity. In this one, we have 4 measures. We're asking the teams to find out. So we're going, the test period is 90 minutes. And in that 90 minutes, each group, each collective needs to come up with some responses to a challenge. And out of all the responses they come up with, they need to narrow down on 2 to 3 that they consider to be novel, useful, feasible. And I think of it as sparky, but I believe the way that the question is worded is the kind of thing that you would be interested in investing your personal time or resources into making happen in the world.
Love it. So are we engaged? Are we willing to put our time where our mouth is and to get skin in the game? Yeah. Reminds me of Gustavo Razzetti, who asked teams to vote for the idea that they're willing to risk their job for.
Right.
And he's working with teams.
Yeah, that's fabulous, right?
Yeah.
Right, like have the hard conversation and be clear about it. Yep. So those are the measures. So the teams themselves will identify, ideally, if they make it successfully through the process, 2 to 3 responses that they rate highly on those criteria. Then the responses from all the teams come into a collective database, and experts in those domains. So if it's, single-use plastics or water or circular economy or whatever it is, can also take a look and comment on those solutions or responses and say, you know what, we've never even seen any idea like that. Fabulous. Or, ooh, we tried that and that doesn't actually work. But if you put this one and this one together, and we'll see what comes up.
Beautiful. Now I understand why you see the impact of this study so much wider beyond the pure outcome, is online or offline better in idea generation. Yeah. What is it that kills creativity? I'm always asking the question, how to make a workshop fail. So how can we fail creativity? How can we kill it?
Lack of physical well-being and emotional well-being.
Yeah. Stress. If you have to be present. And I think if you're worrying about other things, so going back to one of those job skills for the future, being able to create that space for people, or the work environment. It may not even be just that space at that moment in that time, but it's just, hey, are my colleagues, is my boss, is my organization creating an environment that I'm not worrying about all of these other external stressors, so I can be creative regardless of what my job is. Right. I think everybody wants to be creative. It's not just about being creative in the workshop or in that meeting, but all the time. So yeah.
Yeah. Hostile environments of all kinds, right? Like you take enough oxygen out of the room, get it too cold. Those like literal oxygen, those kinds of things can absolutely have an impact.
So everything that stresses us physically and mentally.
Yeah.
And then,
or even have the boss in the room. I think there is a performative factor if you've got the right or the wrong people in the room. And if you feel like you're performing, you're not, that's a stressor, and you're not putting your full energy into being creative because you're aware that somebody is judging you. Yeah.
But adrenaline can also be a push factor to get us to our best performance.
Mm-hmm. There
Similar to time constraints, right? Time constraints can be motivating. And if they're too tight, then they become stressful.
So and there's the facilitator's art, right? So there have been a number of studies that look at like how do you minimize the impact of hierarchical power dominance inhibiting creativity. So the boss is in the room and therefore I won't say the thing that's risky because then they'll think I'm dumb and not give me the promotion. And there was one study that said, you have everybody sit in small groups and tell embarrassing stories from their childhood. And once you hear the boss's embarrassing story, okay then. And I think, Miriam, you talked about having people explain something about them that's very boring. Yeah. Right? Some of the things we do that equalize power structure as a facilitator can help with those. So I think one of the things that's interesting is knowing this list of things that inhibit creativity and going, what of those are in our control? Or things that we can not necessarily control, but we can nudge. We can, sort of shift and poke at to see if we can minimize the downsides and increase the probability of awesomeness on the upside. And I think snacks are like a huge happy nudge. I might actually be hungry right now.
But they do make a difference as well. Like it's the sugary, carby snacks right after lunch or at the coffee break versus something that's more energizing.
Yeah. And having enough water. So yeah, I think it's interesting how do we impact or maybe manipulate the results of workshops by having sugary, kind of this dopamine high just from sugar, versus more healthy snacks and water to have a more grounded conversation that is maybe not as exciting, but more real. This would be an entire different podcast.
I think you've also identified why the kind of research that we're trying to do and why the research we looked at can be so challenging. Because in that study, they had 2 people and they gave them 5 minutes, right? So with 2 people, 5 minutes, a single question, simple things, you can really look at the impact of the camera, right? And if all you're trying to ask is what's the impact of this camera? How do you eliminate as much as possible the impact of whether or not they're hydrated? Well, just don't give them enough time to get dehydrated. They got 5 minutes, that's it. Right? Like all of these things really do make answers very hard to come by. So it'll be fascinating to see how much we come up with that does in fact look like answers in a complex environment, because these are much more complex environments versus suggestions, hints.
Fascinating. So I'm looking forward to having you back here after you run the studies to discuss some of the results and insights.
And to see what you think about all of your experiences participating in on that too.
Yes, and definitely hosting a few of of the experiments. Before we're closing, is there anything that you would have wanted to share that we didn't touch upon yet?
I would like anybody listening to this to hear this as an invitation. So we have talked about how we're putting together this experiment and the symposium and all of these things, but that doesn't mean the we is exclusive or fixed. There are opportunities to come in and help shape every single pace of this work. So if you see some question that we are missing or some angle that we need to test, please come get involved.
Thank you.
Please come and get involved. Sign up for your team to submit a design, and sign your team up to run whatever the winning design is. Sign your team up, your clients up to run the experiment.
Thank you. All the information is in the show notes.
Awesome.
Thanks, Miriam.